Good morning, Detroit. Whew, I am so glad to be here. We are so glad to be here at Race Forward for two reasons. One is because it's the home of so many of our heroes, so many of the movements that have changed our world, so many of the organizations that continue to show us the light forward. Shout out to the Boggs Center. Shout out, yeah, please. Shout out to the Allied Media Projects. Shout out to Detroit Narrative Agency. These are just three of the organizations that have moved me, that inspire me so much. And we're also so happy to be here because this is the first plenary that our new department at Race Forward of Narrative Arts and Culture has been able to put on. And so it's a great honor, it's a great pleasure to be able to do this here in this crucible of radical ideas of Detroit. Now, this election season, the last couple of years, this sort of white lash of an era that we're living through has only served to remind us how important culture is to politics, yeah? There have been countless elections that have seemed to turn on that fundamental divide in the culture wars, this sense of competing narratives between a narrative of a fearful, exclusive America versus an America that's hopeful, that's emergent, that's open and that brings freedom and justice for all. And so we want to highlight that culture is important because it's where we shape the social imagination. Even during these periods and these times when politics feels like it's arrayed against us, when it's stalemated and we can't get any change, it's important for us to be able to advance the social imagination. And I want to make this point. All the other side has to do is preserve the status quo. But what we have to do, our burden, is to persuade people of a nation and a world that has not yet been, that we still are in the process of making together. And so the last point I want to make is this, that when we conceived of this panel, we called it the shift because we're thinking about narrative shift and cultural shift. But in the last few months, what we've seen is that the other side is about narrative shift and cultural shift as well. They've tried to shift the narrative from voting rights to voter fraud, right? From Me Too to white males are victims too, right? And so we're thinking about using different words that highlight the stakes of what we're in right now and what we're really trying to do. Because shift and change are in some ways just descriptive words that describe what is happening in the culture wars, right? That in this tug of war, there's going to be shift and there's going to be change, and sometimes that change isn't good. And so we want to be about power. We want to be about equity. We want to be about justice. We want to be about building narrative power. We want to be about building narrative equity, about building narrative justice, about building cultural power, about building cultural equity, about building cultural justice. And I can't imagine a better group to be able to do that here than this. I'm going to introduce the amazing guests that we have, our friends here today. I wanted to introduce each of you individually so you could come out and get a huge roar of applause and, give you all a big hug and all that kind of stuff. But you all can take care of the applause, right? So, she's the co-visionary behind Octavia's Brood, the author of a book, Emergent Strategy, that has changed the way that we all think about organizing in the current moment. She's going to be doing Racial Justice Reads at 2 p.m., something like that, 1:30 p.m. She's a brilliant doula, healer, writing, and now she can add to her credits Facing Race MC, Adrienne Marie Brown. She's an incredible artist, musician, filmmaker, playwright, community organizer, cultural organizer. She'll also be doing a workshop with the great Tananarive Due at 1:45. called Afrofuturism and Black Horror, and she'd be a hero for all of these things that she does so well to advance our movement. But she's also seared into our minds, right, for the time that she climbed up a flagpole at the State House in Columbia, South Carolina, pulling down the Confederate flag and launching a movement, Bree Newsome. She's one of the most important visual artists of our time. She's my homie. She's the director of Culture Strike, which we helped start together. She's the inventor of the Migration is Beautiful image meme and the creator of the new Ben & Jerry's Pecan Resist flavor, which the right-wing trolls love to hate, but which we know tastes so good. Fabiana Rodriguez. And he's the president of the Color of Change, which has more than 1.4 members building power for Black communities. He's designed countless, and I mean countless, influential, winning social change strategies in corporate accountability, in criminal justice reform, in media justice. And he's helped to build the national infrastructure for narrative. You've heard him on the radio, you've seen him on the TV show, Rashad Robinson. Okay, so for folks in the audience, I should say, if you want to ask a question, please post your question to the Facing Race app, which if you haven't downloaded, you still can. It's up there. And use the hashtag narrative so that staff will know it's a question for our plenary today. We're not going to get to them all, but we might be able to take a few. And so I wanted to start by asking each of you in turn a specific question to kind of help us understand where you're coming from. Yes. And then all together, it might help build kind of a scaffolding for the rest of the discussion that we're going to have here. So Adrienne, let's start with you. Yeah? Okay. Your book, Emergent Strategy, has helped us to rethink how we relate to each other in building our movements. And I'm wondering if you can share what you think Emergent Strategy and the work that you've done, yeah, can tell us about how we act in this current polarized, divided, chaotic moment.
Some thoughts.
Yeah, and you have a microphone. Yeah.
Y'all, there was a microphone in my booty. So let's start there. We all need more butt microphones. Hi, y'all. Hey. I knew ahead of time what this question was going to be, and I wanted to take your time seriously, so I prepared some thoughts, and we'll see how that goes. So one of the biggest pieces to me that I keep thinking, especially after the election on Tuesday, is that we're in a contradiction right now where we have to win as much as we possibly can while never forgetting that the whole game is rigged, right? And if we forget it's rigged, right, then we begin thinking that this win is like the thing, and that we can be in this system and it's the thing. And it's intentional. The game is intentionally designed. It's actually the idea that we think we can win is part of the rigging, right? It's part of the hoodwink. So, but at the same time, the victories we need are the ones that set the conditions by which we can actually work for liberation. But we can't confuse winning in the current paradigm to liberation. You know, those things are different, yeah? So Grace Lee Boggs used to sit in her house, and she would do this move trying to teach me about dialectical humanism. And I feel like it's the difference between the pendulum swinging. We are the losers, we are the winners, now we're the losers again. And doing that same dance from one side to the other, but having it be the loss and the win is all part of how we learn to evolve and to be a liberated species, right? Like that's what we're actually trying to do. So that feels like the biggest thing to me is like recognize that change is constant. That means the winning is temporary. It's always temporary. We need something that's forever. I want a liberation that is forever. I don't want to be like looking over my shoulder like, did I win, but not for real because I'm still waiting for that white racist to come kill me? That's not a win to me. Does that make sense, y'all? Yes? The other piece of it is I think that what liberation means to me is that we shift from demanding power from those who don't love us to remembering we have power and then collectively using it to actually foment love, foment abundance, foment right relationship with this planet, right? That's power. That's what I want. So we have to practice. We have to practice generating and using power in new ways. And we have to practice getting a right relationship with this miraculous planet that we live on. So 3 things, 3 practices. One is moving from clinging and settling for shit that's not good enough for us. We're so good at that. We settle for like a healthcare plan that's not even going to attempt to do anything. And then we cling to it for dear life. And then we're just like all completely messed up in the game. So we need to learn how to instead let go and shape. And I think all the grief that we're facing right now, losing so many people right now, is all about teaching us to let go. There's things we cannot change, and we have to let go. Life ends. We know this. Yes, we do. We know this. Life ends, and we have to let go. We can't hold on, but when we let go, something else becomes possible. And I think the letting go teaches us life is precious. And we need to know it's precious. We need to live right. Okay. That's the first thing. The second, and that's adaptation at its best, right? In mindful, intentional adaptation is like, my life is precious and it's limited and I'm not going to waste it. And so I want to be imaginative. I want to be experimenting. I want to grow. I want to learn. I want to live. And then when it's time, I want to let go and let the next come. Yeah. The second piece is moving from a paradigm of misery and fear to one of joy and possibility. And in movements, we get caught up in the misery and we keep telling people the misery and why are we so terrified? We know we're terrified, we can feel it, but we need to actually be putting our attention on our joy and our possibility. What can we create? We have a short time here. I don't want to spend it complaining about what someone else who doesn't love me has done. I want to spend it being like, how do I move around so that person no longer has influence over me or my nibblings or my family or the borders or my life or our lives, right? And then I feel so much joy because I'm like, bitch, you can't touch me. Trump does not set my mood or my day. That feels good, right? We need to learn that practice. I believe pleasure is a measure of our liberation, right? Pleasure is what was taken from us. You can be here and work for us. No, I can be here and feel the pleasure sensors of my body. I can be alive in connection. To me, that's how I know I'm free. That's how I know I'm free is that I'm like, I had an orgasm every day. I am free. You can't take it from me, all right? The third thing I want to say is moving towards attention liberation that I think yields abundant justice. And I've been talking about this a lot. We waste so much attention on things we can't move or things that are beyond the scale of what we have learned how to do. We waste a lot of attention on canceling people. I think our cancellation practices is a waste of time because we don't actually have enough people to be throwing them off. You know, we're just like, well, shit. But I'm like, okay, good. We've got 3 of us who have never made any mistakes ever in all of history. Let's do it, right? So something about how do we take our attention and put it on transformative justice? How do we take our attention and put it on the work that we can actually do and solution orientation and building together? And I've been saying this piece that if we notice the small, and y'all know I'm a fractal fangirl, but if we notice that like the small, this election was all about the small, right? We were paying attention to races and places of change that we never paid attention to. We're like, oh, we have 2 Muslim congresspeople. We should have 40, but we got 2. Fuck yes, right? That's good. It's small, but it's good. It's the right move. We've got these 19 black judges in Houston. I'm here for it, okay? I'm here for it, Texas, okay? I was born in Texas. I feel some responsibility for Beyonce and these judges. And, right? Those 2 things, right? But really starting to notice, if we notice the small is where we learn the things we're going to need to know to hold the whole, right? And right now, I think we don't know enough about how to hold. but we could learn. And so the learning happens at a small scale. We need justice. You and me need justice. The 5 of us need justice. This room needs justice. Then maybe we can contend for the justice we're actually seeking out in the world. Those are my thoughts.
Beautiful thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. What I love about this panel, actually, is we've got such a diversity of approaches. It's such a diversity of ways of coming at the question of how we apply strategy to the arts, narrative, to culture. Rashad, you've been such an inspiration to me because of the way that you think about strategy and campaigns and work, and beyond campaigns, but thinking about how we build power. You had a great piece that you wrote for the Haas Institute on building narrative power, and you've done, of course, all kinds of work during your decades of work through GLAAD. And I'm sorry, did I call you out in decades work? The years of work, months of work. No, but it's been really powerful work that you've been doing through Color of Change, before that through GLAAD, and a bunch of other places. I'm wondering if you can share us some of your thinking about how you're looking at strategically moving us towards justice now. Talk about that. Tell us a little bit about the way that you think about this.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And it's great to be with you. How's everyone doing? Great. I know it's early, but Favi and I both decided we're going to stand. And we got like some height stuff going on here, so we're going to make that work. I think I have some slides.
Yes.
You do?
I do.
Hit it, yeah.
If I hit it, it'll go.
Oh, okay, here we go.
Perfect. But they're not.
It'll come up.
They'll come up. Okay.
Yay!
All right. So first and foremost, when I think about narrative, I think about it in terms of power. Because narrative without power does nothing for anyone. While it is important and interesting and great in the sort of context of changing the rules of society, if we're not thinking about how do we change both the written rules of policy and the unwritten rules of culture, then what we are doing is in many ways, we're going to be playing whack-a-mole with a whole bunch of things that our opponents are throwing at us. You know that game at the carnival where something pops up and you hit it and something else pops up and you hit it? That's oftentimes what we end up doing in our movement if we're not actually working to change the rules. I think about this in terms of how Color of Change started 13 years ago. In the aftermath of a flood that was caused by bad decision makers, Hurricane Katrina. It turned into a life-altering disaster by those same bad decision makers. And for those of us who were watching at the time, or there in the Gulf Coast, we probably cannot forget those images of black people on their roofs, begging for the government to do something, and literally left to die. And Katrina illustrated a whole bunch of things that we already knew about: geographic segregation, generational poverty, the impacts of what we've done to our planet, and so many other systems. But at the heart of it, no one was nervous about disappointing black people. And when institutions are not nervous about disappointing your community, a research report is not going to really help you with all the facts, because research and information is not power. Power is power. And, you know, with all due respect to my friends in the legal community, if we don't have the necessary power and narrative change, going into the courts is not always going to help us, and we're learning that clearly right now. And with all due respect to my friends in Silicon Valley, we won't be able to code our way out of structural racism. Power is the ability to change the rules. And so at Color of Change, we think about that in terms of the unwritten rules of narrative and the written rules of policy. And we think about it operationalizing that into really clear work every single day. Working through research to really understand our targets and move people to action on really clear sort of ways, finding the sort of strategic opening every single day that can move energy, move the presence of an issue into the power to make real change, and not mistaking presence for power. Recognizing that we have to be in cultural production. We have to produce our own information as much as we have to respond to the stuff that's being put out in the air. We have to stop their stuff and put out our own stuff. And we have to be willing to immerse people in our worldview. And so that doesn't mean just 1 or 2 videos that get 10,000 views or 20,000 views and think that we're going to beat the NRA with 10 million views. It means that we have to think differently about moving people in a really clear way, about understanding our stories. And that means not just investing in trying to create our own networks or platforms, but investing in real people to tell our stories and to move our narratives. Investing in folks on the ground who are actually telling their stories and moving narratives. And then actually building really clear campaigns. Campaigns that actually have the ability to win and move more people to action. Far too often, people see inequality, poverty, racism, sexism as unfortunate, almost like a car accident. And when I say people, I'm not just talking about the people on the right. I'm saying that this is the stories that sometimes come out of the mega churches on the left, the stories that we see in a Tyler Perry movie. The stories that people have done something to put themselves in this situation that leads us into reactions that actually don't move the needle. When we leave people at unfortunate rather than unjust, folks deliver water to Michigan in bottles instead of working to deal with the fact that the water has been polluted by corporations. Folks, when we end up in unfortunate to unjust, folks show up. Corporations show up to clean up and mentor kids in inner city schools instead of dealing what we've done to public education in this country. When we leave people at unfortunate rather than unjust, folks get really passionate about the criminal justice system and stop at reentry instead of ending mass incarceration. I say all of that because when we talk about narrative change, sometimes it can feel squishy. Everyone is doing narrative change. Everyone thinks we've changed the narrative with a video or a press release or one individual campaign. But if we are not actually building the structures that actually change the rules of engagement and change the terms in the landscape of which we are campaigning on, then we will continue to run around in circles while our opponents build more and more power to do more and more horrible things to our communities. And so I want to talk about what this actually looks like. We've built this theory around operating in the many different places where people are, because there is places that our people are. They're watching TV, they're watching movies, they're on the internet. And if we are not engaging in real conversations, if we're only talking to ourselves in these conferences and getting really clear about the language that we feel, but we go to our Thanksgiving tables and our people are not even with us in our own families, then we are not actually doing the work. We're doing the things that make us feel comfortable, because feeling comfortable is something that we like, but it's actually not moving the needle on the justice. It's not keeping a high standard about what narrative change actually looks like and about actually changing the rules for the people who need us. And so across many different spaces, and I'm just going to point to a couple of things on this slide, if you can put them back up. I have a picture of public characters. That's Larry Krasner, the district attorney in Philadelphia. Sure, we can give him an applause, but I'm not here to praise district attorneys. But Larry Krasner, though, as a narrative figure that has gone into office and done a whole set of things that a year ago seemed impossible, has raised the floor on what's acceptable and pushed up the ceiling on what's possible. And that means changing the rules on what a district attorney can actually do. It doesn't, though, mean, to Adrian's point here, that we simply accept the landscape that district attorneys should have all the power that they have. It means, though, that at some point we have to win something so we can win the big thing down the road. That our people need us to win along the way so things start to change and people experience a different world. It means that we have to engage in Hollywood, engage in the writer's room, so that folks are seeing the stories and narratives that actually move conversations in ways that we could never do through conferences, through press releases, through op-ed pieces. That we have to be in the places that our people are. We have to think about the information and the rules of the internet, the rules of algorithms, the rules of how those stories are told. We have to be in all of these different spaces in ways that hold those institutions accountable while pushing them to do something better. I want to end where I began, on the idea of no one being nervous about disappointing us. and what that means for writing a new story for our liberation. When people talk about narrative, I want us to keep a much higher standard about what that means. Yes, it means stories. Yes, it means conversation. But at some point, it has to mean real change. It has to mean that the rules for how we get to show up in our schools and our hospitals has to change in really clear ways. Because making justice real for the people who need us, changing the narrative from unfortunate to unjust, requires all of us to be in motion in a new way, to tell a new story, and to build the type of campaigns that push on the institutions and the infrastructure that have been holding us back for far too long.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rashad. Favi, you know, your work has been so much about advancing art, yeah, as the way to be able to get us to rethink so many different types of things. We have a poster here that was actually taken down earlier. It's about Puerto Rico. That's what this poster is doing up here. And for those of you who weren't here last night, the poster was taken down, and we wanted to reaffirm our belief, our deep feeling that art is so important to be able to lift up our stories, to be able to put our feelings out into the world, and to be able to imagine change. And this has been so much what your work has been about. Can you tell us how you think art and artists are central to change?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Faviana. I am going to put up some art as well. And we are a little short on time, so I'm going to talk really fast. I'm an artist because I felt since I was a kid that there was not enough representations of people who looked like me, whether it was in dolls or in children's books. I felt very invisible, and so much about art, you know, as human beings, we understand the world through science and through art. And art is about making myths, and it's about really creating a story of self. Culture is power. Can we have the slides up, please? And culture is not just transformative for us as individuals and as people, but it allows us to see the view of the world. And overwhelmingly right now, the view of the world that we see is through a white male gaze. Whether it's the music we're listening to or the films we're interacting with or even the visual culture, overwhelmingly white men control it. I was going to show you a video, but I'm going to have to pass. I'm going to have to go. Can you? Okay, there we go. Yes, I don't have time, but basically Fox News completely analyzed the pecan resist pint and said, oh, these leftists, they used to stay in their nice little clean lane, but now they're moving into other spaces, even into our ice cream. They're moving into everything, and they're making, they are, and he actually said the words. He said, these leftists and they're damn, the personal is political. But that's exactly it, is that our personal experiences can shape so many of the stories that we talk about in culture. When we think about lasting social change, we need to activate not just the political sector, not just people elected in office, but the cultural sector and the economic sector as well. And often in culture, as a progressive movement, we have not invested in culture. Our movements are not hiring artists. We are not investing in creatives. We're not putting in support to really grow the infrastructure. In fact, in the country, 4 out of 5 working artists are white. And so not only do we have the problem that we're not visible in the cultural sector, but there is systemic racism working from the point that a young child is in school with lack of arts programs, lack of access. And what that does is that it completely creates and entrenches white supremacy in the cultural sector. The other thing is when we talk about arts and culture, when we talk about cultural overall, it's an ecosystem. And I really love that we use the planet as a way to talk about this. But just like the planet needs to be biodiverse, we need diversity in order for us to survive as a species. We also need a diversity of narratives. We need to be able to see the stories, the complexity. So many times what we're exposed to in mainstream culture is that white people, and specifically white men, get to be the ultimate representation of what it means to be human. And so white men can be astronauts, or they can hang out with dragons, or they can be underground, or in outer space, or in the sea. And meanwhile, people of color are relegated to such stereotypical and narrow perspectives. And what it does, it erases complexity. And we need complexity. In order to combat racism, we need an abundance of stories and images and narratives that really show our full humanity. And the other thing is that, as an ecosystem, I think that often we think, well, why do we need pop culture? Those Hollywood people are doing fine. But as we've learned through the Time's Up movement, even in spaces like Hollywood, sexual harassment, abuse, and systemic racism are the norm in some of the most powerful places. And so what would it look like for us to unite with artists like America Ferrera or Alicia Keys or the undocumented artist Julio Salgado, who's a part of Culture Strike, for us to really build cultural power? Because as artists, we are unorganized. We are an unorganized base. And in our movements, we talk about the importance of organizers and of communications people, but we can't leave artists and cultural workers out of the equation because we need them in order to win. And finally, I'll close with this so that you truly understand what we're up against. We know that the narrative system, we know that white men control the narrative system. And when I mean the narrative system, whether it's music or film or visual culture or publishing or poetry, white men control about 96 to 98% of those systems. Whether they're the art critics or the people giving out the awards or the people financing, they got a lockdown on the cultural infrastructure. And that's why we need to really understand that our fight is also in fighting for cultural power. But in addition to that, our philanthropic sector, the arts and culture sector, only give 4% of money to people of color. 4% of money goes to communities of people of color, which really explains that we're completely ill-equipped to fight in this cultural battleground. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Favianna. Bree, you're such an example to all of us. I think one of the things, though, that's not talked about is how you cover the whole spectrum. You've done community organizing, you've done it incredibly well, and you've done artistic work, and you've done that incredibly well. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see your arts practice and your political practice, how they fit together in this amazing life.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I constantly tell people as an organizer, because one of the most common questions we get is, what can I do? What can I do? Or people will ask me, how do I become an activist? Which I think is an interesting question, because it's not really something that you sit down, well, at least not for me, and I think for a lot of people, it's not really something you sit down and you plot, I think I'll become an activist today, It's really more like you encounter something, you see an injustice, you're like, well, I gotta act. Therefore, I'm an activist because I'm taking action, right? And so one of the things I tell people is do a self-assessment of your tools, of your talents, of your skills. What can you bring to the table? Because we're making stone soup, right? We are trying to dismantle an extremely highly organized system that has been organized over centuries. And that's the thing that's important to understand. We did not get here overnight. This has been the work of people organizing this highly complex system of white supremacy to have the world exist and be in a particular order where wealth and power and resources are concentrated among a predominantly white few, and poverty is concentrated around much of the world and mostly among those who are dark in complexion, right? That's the reality that people are organizing around. And so for me, that just practically happens to be my artistic talents. I'm a communicator. That is my background. I was trained in the arts. I was trained to be a filmmaker. Funny enough, though, back in like 2013 when everything was going on with Trayvon Martin, I was not an activist necessarily. I was not protesting in the street. I was certainly not an organizer. I didn't know what an organizer was. I did know that we had this thing called social media that I had been on for a while, and I had been posting a whole bunch of other nonsense, and now I knew that here was a tool and here was a time where it was very important to make people aware of what is going on, because there is absolutely a false dominant narrative that has to be challenged. And I think I want to say two things. One, I believe that you cannot overestimate the importance of story and the role that that plays in humanity. It is literally how we organize ourselves. It's how we understand who we are, where I am on this rock that is spinning around the sun, right? If I ask you, well, what brought you here today? You would answer me by telling me a story about who you are and what brought you here today. That's how we understand who we are as a people. Part of the problem that we face right now is we live in a society that is organized around a lie. It's organized around mistruths. And the myth is that this is the natural order of things, that the world order that I just described to you, where wealth is concentrated among a few and the many live in poverty, that is simply the natural order of things. But we know that's not the case. We know that, as she was describing, children being deprived of arts education, that is a policy decision that someone makes. That's not the natural order of things, right? So if I'm coming into the space in my toolkit, I have arts and communication. That's what I'm trying to bring to the table. So we started out, at one point people derisively called us hashtag activist. But it's important to recognize that that's an important role, and I still use Twitter in a strong way in that way to challenge the dominant narrative, because you have to understand the news day starts with conservative circles sending out talking points. That's why by the time you get to 5 p.m., you see them all saying the same exact thing, because they start the day off by planning out what is the story, what is the narrative going to be that we are going to pump out to the masses. The Confederate flag situation, right? And the issue with Confederate monuments. This is about story. This is about myth. In the early 20th century, they began a campaign of trying to rewrite the history of the Civil War, to downplay the role of slavery, to downplay the significance of slavery, and to create this, new story about the lost cause. And they did that in order to justify Jim Crow, a new order that they are trying to establish across the South. That's the power of symbology. That's why we put monuments up to tell a story, to remind future generations. It says something. When you have a statue of Robert E. Lee looking valiant on a horse, what you're saying is that this cause that he fought for, he is a hero because of the cause that he fought for, right? This Confederate flag, that's what it means, right? So the Confederate flag in South Carolina, let's take this as a specific example. This flag was raised originally over the dome of the State House in 1961. Now, they said that it was to mark the 100-year anniversary of the Civil War, which would have been 1960, so that doesn't make sense. But what else was happening in 1961 was massive sit-in protests, including one in Rock Hill, South Carolina, that really shook things up. So we know that the real reason that that flag was raised was as a symbol of white supremacy. That flag tells a story. What it says is that we may have lost the Civil War, but this is still white power here. And we're letting you know that we're not giving in to the civil rights movement, right? They agreed in 2000 to move the flag to the lawn, and at that time, they wrote into the law that the flag could not be lowered for any reason unless there was a 2/3 majority in the State House, okay? So that's where things were at. When in 2015, a white supremacist in Columbia, South Carolina, where the flag had been flying for 54 years, drove down to Charleston, South Carolina, and murdered 9 black people in Mother Emanuel, AME. In the immediate aftermath, they refused to lower the flag. They lowered the American flag, they lowered the state flag of South Carolina, but the Confederate flag stayed at the top of the pole, even as they were processing through the streets of Columbia, South Carolina, the casket of Clementa Pinckney, who was the pastor of Mother Emanuel, and a state senator. Okay, that says something. That symbology tells a story. What it is telling us is that the symbol of white power, that white power flies above every other authority in the state and in the nation. So I want to keep this short because I know we want to. But I just to give because I'm a very practical person. Like I show up to the fight and I'm like, okay, so what can I do? Like that's my mentality with it. If I'm trying to go from point A to point Z, I wanted to know how practically to get there. So I got together with other activists and we made the decision the flag has to come down, and it has to come down immediately for these reasons. One, everything that I just stated about what it represents, but we also can't participate in this farce. We can't participate in this farce of waiting for the State House to determine my dignity as a human being, right? As Adrian said earlier, it's about recognizing our power, that it is quite literally fabric attached to a metal pole. And the idea that we can't take it down unless these other people enshrined in this power that they have blocked us from attaining tells us that it can be taken down. So that was why we made the decision that the flag had to be taken down immediately. Now I just want to talk a little bit about why we did it the way that we did it, because that was also about the second thing that I want to talk about, which is creating the conditions for people to feel free to imagine a new world and new possibilities, right? So the flag flying high, it sent a very strong message, and we were in a time of mourning, obviously, in a time of deep devastation and shock. You have to remember this is coming just a few months after the Walter Scott case. This is coming, obviously, in the midst of heightened protest activity. So we knew we were going to go and take it down. They had created an internal pulley system on the flag so that nobody could actually go up and cut the rope. They had done they put a 4-foot-tall spoked fence. I mean, all of these resources to protect this flag. So we knew that the only practical way to get it down was somebody would have to scale to the top and take it down. That's how we decided it. We thought to ourselves, should we go there in the middle of the night, maybe just snatch it and run away, and then nobody knows, what happened to it? And we said no, because we wanted to draw a clear contrast with what had happened in Charleston. In Charleston, a coward had gone into a church, had murdered black people, used the most bullets for an elderly black woman, and I think that says a lot, and then snuck away. So I was going to go out in broad daylight, fully vulnerable, and show that I am not afraid, and that we will not allow ourselves to be ruled by fear. The scaling of the pole, like I said, that was the method that we had to practically use, but it ended up being very powerful in its demonstration because in that moment I was able to symbolize the entire struggle to dismantle what is symbolized by the flag there. And some people thought that, I think if you've seen the video, you see where I was praying and I was, saying different things, and that people thought that was part of the demonstration as well. No, that was me praying. No, that was me having a very, very real moment of prayer and meditation as I was scaling the pole. But again, I was channeling something, and the reason that people felt that was because it was very real. And I honestly, when I say that I'm an artist, that's what I mean. I believe that the role of the artist is to observe the times. I believe that we are observers of life. Biologists study kind of like the building blocks of life in a very kind of concrete way. I believe that the role of artists, we observe life. We study the way that life really acts out, and then we reflect it back through our bodies and through channeling that energy and through creating that. And so when I had been in the lead up to scaling the pole, was really meditating on scripture. I meditated a lot on the story of David and Goliath, actually. And in the scripture, when David goes out in front of to face Goliath, he says to Goliath, "You come against me with spear and javelin," I believe he says, "and shield, and I come against you in the name of God," right? And so when I got to the top, that's the first thing that came to my mind. You come against me with fear and hatred and oppression and violence, and I come against you in the name of God. And I meant that. And I knew that taking the flag down on that day wasn't going to end white supremacy. Of course not. I'm a community organizer. I know that taking down a flag is not going to end white supremacy, but what it symbolizes is that, again, we don't have to wait on this power structure that was installed over us to take it down. Clearly, it can be taken down, right? They sent somebody out in the immediate aftermath to raise the flag back up. But even then, and I knew even if I hadn't made it to the top, the point would still be made that this is a symbol for how we do it. And then what was so amazing in the aftermath was to see all of the other art that was generated from it. All these other people who were creating depictions. And that's what I mean about using art to let people imagine. This is the last thing I'm going to say, and then I promise I'll put the mic down. I really naively at one point when I was like, this is crazy, because I was up in like 2012, I was up in New York, and I was an artist in residence, like this very kind of corporate environment. And that's when like everything was popping off with Occupy and Trayvon. And once that my residency ended, I was like, I can't go back to a cubicle. And I really kind of felt like, well, maybe I need to steer away from my ambition as an artist and just focus on being an organizer. I recognize now how powerful art is, and so I'm just like more focused on how to use my skills in that way. I remember like when I saw Black Panther come out, and just to see little kids, and the way that it shifted their thinking and their like you can see the shift in their eyes and their minds, right? And that's what we have to do, because in order to get from point A to point Z, it's not just policy change. We have to have the space in there where we are dreaming and imagining what that world looks like, so then we can build it.
That's Bree Newsom, y'all. Catch Bree with Tananarive Due this afternoon, 1:30. Adrienne Marie Brown, Racial Justice Reads, 1:30. Fabiana Rodriguez, Eat a Lot of Pecan Resist, right? Do that. And Rashad Robinson, support Color of Change, support their narrative work. Please give it up for this amazing panel.